We good? Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Enterprising Minds. We have everybody on board today. Dave, Alex, and Ruthie. This is a really loosey-goosey kind of episode today, and it's going to be shorter than our normal ones, which may be appreciated, may be disappointing to some, depending on how much you listened. Alex, you came the most prepared, so you start us off with your topic.
Sure. So I think later on we're going to talk about books, but there's a book that I've been reading and I'm just partway into it. So I'm still kind of those early thoughts on it. Book is called On Grand Strategy. That's the title. But there's a number of different kind of topics that are presented and they're kind of slowly coalescing together. So I haven't finished it yet, but these early thoughts have been pretty fascinating to me. And I want to talk to you guys about kind of diversity of personalities within teams. So specific to the book, they had talked about the idea of the kind of modes of thinking of the fox versus the hedgehog. And the idea was basically is the fox is thinking about all the possibilities and all the different things, but quickly could become as a detriment, overwhelmed with that and paralyzed because they're thinking of all these potential pitfalls of what might happen. The hedgehog on the other hand is like very much more focused on a singular task, singular goal, and exists and functions really well when all things line up, but also has the detriment of not really, thinking about all the different factors that may play in. So the example that was used was Xerxes when he was basically trying to conquer most of Greece. He was going forward with a massive army, one that had been larger than most armies we've never seen before. They had to build bridges across rivers. They dug a channel so that boats could even be connected because it was just impossible to get this massive amount of forces just from one place to the next. And Greek islands and all the rest. I mean, the terrain is not helpful at all. So you had an advisor who was talking about, well, how we're going to feed everybody. Your people are going to drink the rivers dry. They're going to eat all the food in the area. They can't be there for too long. If it's winter, it won't work too well. I mean, coming up with all these problems, like you need to stop and you need to go home. Forget it. Forget this campaign. You need to go home. And Xerxes basically was solely focused on this idea that I can just go forward with strength and it will just work out. And just keep on pushing forward. So eventually the advisor and him got to kind of to a head to a point that he sent his advisor home to take care of the homelands and basically be in charge of that while he continues on the war path. And ultimately he hits defeat because of some massive issues here, there, and a lot of lack of intelligence, a lot of lack of recon, a lot of lack of understanding of exactly how this whole thing is actually going to play out and logistics and all the rest. Yep. But he would have never done it and never even started it, nor become, well known as he is, if he hadn't even started. So there is this still kind of this back and forth moment of, do you try to look at all the different factors and try to bring those in and try to come up with a solution and plan for as much of those as possible? Or do you try to stay focused on this end result and just try to keep pushing forward to it, knowing that motivation, that drive will create accomplishment? So which do you lean on? Maybe maybe a mix of both, maybe it's contextual, but which would you personally lean on? And then in the teams that you've worked in, do you think that a mix like that works well? Do you think that you should have more foxes that are more kind of all over the place, kind of looking at all the angles, or you should have more hedgehogs so you have more driven of a team? What do you think has more success?
Oh, I love this question so much. I have at least 5 different answers to this question.
That works.
The first, because it's hedgehogs and foxes, and because I have small children. We have read the story The Mitten. If you guys haven't read this, it's like a little story about a little boy who loses his mitten and, a little... it might be a hedgehog that starts out, finds it cozy, and then enjoins a badger and enjoins a fox and enjoins a bear. And obviously this mitten can't handle all of it. So when the mouse finally joins everybody and the bear sneezes, they all fall out. But the point is, Well, actually, I don't know that there's a point there so much as you're talking about foxes and hedgehogs, it occurs to me, right? It's a mix. It's always a mix. I suspect that it's a sliding scale, and you might have a team of hedgehogs that are really fantastic at one type of project, and you might have a team of foxes that are really fantastic at another, but for the majority of projects, you're going to have some mix there in the middle. And I know for me, when I'm thinking about team building and how I'm building both my own team, but then also little teams on different projects where you might need different skill sets, I might pick and choose based on the type of project, right? If there's something that needs a lot of technical documentation, or you're just figuring out a process, well, maybe you want a few more hedgehogs. But if you're working in an uncharted territory, you want a bunch of foxes in the room because you don't necessarily know the right path to go, but you might want a hedgehog because a little direction and a little sort of orderliness is good. One of the other directions that my thoughts went as you were describing the situation and some of the questions towards the end, Alex, was I had read earlier this year a book by Temple Grandin called Visual Thinking, where she talks about different ways that people think, right? Some people think just in words, and their stream of consciousness is word-based. Some people think only in pictures, which, if you think only in word-based, it's hard to imagine thinking only in pictures and not having sort of that voice in your head, and vice versa. If you think only in pictures, it's hard to even imagine that there's a dialogue going on in somebody else's head. Yeah. One of the sections of that book talks about, hey, it's really important, and some of the best work that's been done in the world happens when these different ways of thinking, of which there's more than just two, of course, but when these different ways of thinking come together on a joint project. And one of the key examples she gives, which I love, is the architect and the engineer. You've got the architect who thinks of the amazing building and the design, the Guggenheim, this new way of building a building. But then you always have the engineer who's figuring out, hey, these are the details that matter, that are going to make it so it doesn't collapse, that are going to make it so it can last, that are going to even make it feasible. And sometimes the architect and engineer can come together in one mind. And when it does, it's pretty fantastic. But oftentimes it's more than one person coming together in order to bring the vision to life. And so when I think about that dichotomy, less about the hedgehog and the fox, of which I'm sure I have little bits of each, I think of myself way more in that architect category, that's sort of putting forth the vision. But I always know I need an engineer to be working hand in hand to say, is this going to work? Or how do we bring this to life? What are some of the ways we can use different materials to make it possible?
I like that, the perspective of especially the architect and engineer. I was thinking of Frank Lloyd Wright. He was actually born in Wisconsin, and he's got a number of buildings that have very flat roofs, which, if you know anything about like the weather in upper Midwest, that doesn't work because you have snow sitting for long periods of time. You're going to have ice build up. You're going to have water damage. Basically, that's a bad idea. You have to have a slope. So it's always been funny to me when you see some of his homes, such as like Falling Water is one in particular that I always think about, that has like a very flat pitch and stuff like that. And it has had a lot of water damage, as it turns out. They've had to like do a lot of repairs and stuff to it. But it's also a gorgeous kind of instrument you break people out of the same plan, the same pattern that's been used in homes over and over again. And instead trying to say, no, we had a very beautiful location and we're going to build a home that basically fits to the location, not basically bulldoze the land until it becomes this flat building block and then we're going to plop a home on top of it. It's such a different way of thinking, and it broke through and it works. I mean, it does. Yeah, there's some repairs made, but my gosh, it does work. So, Dave, what about you?
Well, it's funny that you bring up the dichotomy. I wasn't going to talk about this book, but I finished it yesterday. It's Malcolm Gladwell's Bomber Mafia. And in very typical, Gladwell, it's all of these seemingly unrelated things that come into play. But the two kind of main characters that he focuses on were two leaders in the Army Air Corps, which is now, Air Force, during World War II. And they were basically polar opposites of one another. One of them was a lead from the front. If you're nervous about doing this, this bombing run, then I'll be in the lead plane. You follow me, kind of, no excuses, get it done kind of guy. Then this other guy was this, romantic, overly theoretical kind of guy who was very much more intellectual about the purpose and the strategies and the, how to utilize everything. And the tactical guy, both of them ended up being transferred to the Pacific front after they did what they needed to do in Germany. And the lead from the front guy, get it done, ended up replacing the other guy because he was the more theoretical guy was much more focused on precision bombing and wanted to really prove that out to minimize casualties. But he wasn't showing enough results. So then they went to the other guy because he wasn't afraid of using napalm. He wasn't afraid of using, more daring and crazy ideas like flying at 5,000 feet because, the jet stream over Japan is insane, at high altitude. So all the techniques that worked for the German campaign wouldn't work for the Japanese one. And it is just fascinating. You need both. I think you do need both. All of the best teams that I've been a part of have been a mix of people who are very good at particular things that ladder up into a larger whole. Because then you can cover blind spots. I think it's good to be able to say, we want to do this. Like, I'm a big fan of doing the pre-mortems. Have you ever heard of this? Yeah, where you basically pretend like you're having a horrible client call where you just say, okay, our idea didn't work. This is how we're going to have to fix it. And you basically have to poke holes in your idea on why it failed before you even launch it. Right. So you can cover the basis of how it might fail. However, that can be paralyzing for some personalities. Right. So you do need to be able to say, okay, that's enough. Let's just launch the thing. Right. Which is, I've come to appreciate more recently is a fantastic skill set that not everybody has. Being able to say, okay, just launch it. Yeah.
It's scary. Yeah. Do it live.
Exactly.
One thing that comes to mind, Dave, just quick, Alex.
Yeah.
Is when you've got those multiple perspectives in the room, equally important as knowing how to not get paralyzed and just move is knowing how to make sure the voices are heard. Because it's one thing to have the right voices in the room. It's the other to actually listen to what those voices are saying, especially when they're disagreeing with what's going on in your head.
Yeah, ego plays an important role there. If you have egotistical thought leaders, you're in trouble. If it's, people who are really good at what they do and are willing to listen to other people, you're golden. But, that's a unicorn in a sea of horses.
Yeah, that was what I was about to run into is exactly that. It's the respect between those individuals as well. You can definitely see, especially in the military situation, a lot of tension, life and death decisions being made. You've got one guy who's very theoretical and the other one who's, damn it all, we're going to get it done sort of personality type. You're going to have some major tension between those two individuals. But the two of them have to have respect for each other and have to be able to work with each other. And I think that's one of the more difficult things. Getting those different personalities in a room is one thing, but exactly to Ruthie's point, getting those voices to be heard and also respected and have those different points of view be understood and actual communication going on, speaking again to like the idea of, people who think in words versus pictures. I mean, you do need to have that facilitation there too. And if you can't get that to happen, I don't think all the heads in one room even matters.
Well, one of my favorite guitarist, composer guys. His name's Devin Townsend, and he's very esoteric, so not everybody will like him. But he has that condition where you see like music will literally show like shapes and colors to you. And so that's how he composes, is through that. So like G major is green, and you just start kind of painting with the tones, which explains, some of the interesting choices that he makes because of, that particular condition. I forget what it's called. But that ends up becoming part of the unique skill set. Even some people would say it's a detriment, but really, honestly, it's one of those unique flavors of him that allows him to do what he does really well. Yeah.
There was an emotional well-being exercise I was doing this week that similar concept. Basically, it's a color wheel, but it's emotions as well. And so instead of just anger, you might have resentment, revenge, jealousy. I mean, it could be like, much smaller, more precisely named adjectives kind of underneath of that. But part of the exercise is naming kind of how you're doing, but also just getting beyond the I'm okay, I'm good sort of response, and getting to this deeper level and saying, okay, what are a couple different things? Keep calm and rage on. Dave's holding up a mug that says keep calm and rage on. Yeah, maybe that's red, or maybe that's black. I mean, what color that is to you. But the other point was, it was basically basically to name a much more precise emotion, name 3 of them that basically you're experiencing, but also what colors do they apply, and then where do you feel them? Getting to some of the physical connections of emotion. So if you're feeling tension, maybe you feel it in your back, your neck, your stomach because you're nervous. I mean, there's different pieces like that. But it's to enrich the idea, but also to make it more memorable. So each day you're thinking of something a little bit more memorable, and just trying to think of a word that may not have a whole lot of meaning to you, hoping that basically that color, that feeling has more meaning to you. So that's kind of where that runs into. But
interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting little exercise. But so Fox and the Hedgehog, those were kind of some of the first ideas from the book. Later into it, they started talking about the idea of a true north. So I can run into that too, but I'm curious about you guys. Did you have a different topic you want to run to first?
Well, so I'll just say for me, and maybe this will spur on further conversation.
Sure.
I have always been the kind of guy that needs that North Star to say, like, here's the big, crazy, hairy, audacious goal that we're going to go after. It might take us 5-10 years, but by God, we're going to get there. And then, work backwards from that. So, I mean, that's the same when I was doing music. It's the same thing. I want to play this festival. In order to play this festival, I need to be seen as a good thing for the promoter that does that festival, which means I have to have a whole bunch of gigs locally that produce enough people to know about us, to be able to build a media kit, to be able to send to the producer, to that, you dot. So it ends up giving you this roadmap to being able to get to that thing. It's the same kind of thing you do when I want to sell $100,000 worth of, product. Okay. How do you do that? Without that, I find myself, and this happens after every big project ends. I don't know about you guys, but I always feel like I'm just kind of treading water for a while. Like I'm trying to, I'll test out some idea over here, or I'll read this book to try to find inspiration somewhere else. I try to find whatever gives me that spark, of okay, I want to drive this way now. It's literally after every single big project that I do, I end up being aimless for a little bit, and then I find something and go after it, to the point where I've just, come to terms with it and acknowledge that it's just part of the process, even though it's not fun to be kind of aimless for a while. It's just, that just means you're beginning a new creative stage for me. So yeah.
Ruthie?
Yeah. I have a number of thoughts on this. I have a very different experience than what you described about project to project and being aimless and sort of needing that North Star. Big picture, like once upon a time, I had a plan of action. This is how my life was going to go. It's going to go in this particular direction. And as many others who have had a similar experience, a bunch of little things happen, and all of a sudden the plan goes in a very different direction. It's no longer a plan. That plan goes out the window, and you find yourself in a very different spot. And through the process of, I mean, that's like over the course of over a decade, right? Through the process of having a very concrete plan to just not, a lot of the learning along the way has been shifted towards having notions and directionally, here's where I want to go. I want to lean into these types of things. I think these will make my life better. As a specific example, right? I like gardening. More gardening, good. That's sort of a notional direction, right? I like doing interesting projects with people who are excited about it, right? That's a notion. That's not a like, this is my career trajectory over the next 10 years. These are things I want to do more of, and the more that I can do of them, the more contentment and fulfillment I get out of my day to day. That said, in the short term, projects, work projects, like, home projects, etc., I always have a direction we're going. It's very concrete. We'll go there. Concrete is in the sense that I can visualize it, not in the sense of like, we must meet this end. More just, I've got a very clear direction we're going, and you can build a roadmap back, and you can help people guide along to go. And I don't often find myself in the position you described, Dave, where you've got sort of a pause between projects and a malaise. Instead, I have the opposite project of like, all right, we're on to the next one. We're on to the next one. And it's sort of a constant slew of projects and things I'm doing. And I get caught up in the swirl, I would say, of the different projects. And so my challenge is to force myself to pause and go, hang on, is this in line with the directional notions that are going to lend fulfillment and contentment in your life? And to make sure that the projects that I can get swept up in aren't taking me completely off course of the notional direction that I want to go in.
Out of pure curiosity, when you're in the swirl of a multitude of projects, how many do you finish?
I don't know. You guys would know as well as me what the track record is, right? You guys have been in a lot of them. I mean, I would say, from a house project perspective, I think I did this the last time, like when we moved and I had a whole bunch of things that I knew I wanted to get done. I think my completion rate was somewhere between 60 and 70%. And the extra 30 to 40% were things that throughout the process, it was like either that just fell off, didn't have the actual capacity to do it, or it turns out it wasn't as important. So that's the only specific numbers I can lend you off the top of my head.
And it's interesting because there are certain elements and certain aspects in my life, if we do the holistic thing, building off of what you said, when it comes to like work projects or creative projects, there's a definitive, like, it's done, it's shipped, right? You write a blog, you do a podcast, you do a song, it's done, it's shipped, it's out in the world now, right? Whereas diet and health and exercise is much more of that Kaizen, just do a little bit better every day. And eventually you'll turn around and go, oh, wow, that was a lot. Right. The context for me plays a big thing. And I think we talked about this in an earlier episode too, of for whatever reason, the fall and the winter ends up being a time where I really want to just like sit down and write. And so that impulse to be creative in that medium is way higher than any other time of the year. And so if I'm going to take advantage of the seasonality of my creativity and my kind of my impulses, then I'm going to go do that. Like I'm going to sit down and focus. And I've discovered I'm more productive when I have specific rituals around specific activities, because it just focuses the brain and does what I need it to do. Another idea, this is going to be a left kind of circle back, left turn, but in Alchemy, Rory Sutherland's book, and in a lot of his other presentations that we've talked about previously, he talks about bees and how actually there are a certain percentage of the bees in any given colony that don't go to the flowers that everybody else is talking about, because they need to be able to find the next field, right? Because if they only pollinate the same things, close to their hive, the whole colony will die, right? And so it's what seems like, oh, the weirdos are going off, maybe they won't come back, is actually essential to the whole system. You need those bees finding new flowers, new trees, new, whatever else. And yeah, there's probably a higher fail rate because there's, a smaller percentage of them going and doing that. But, again, go to the whole, you need that blend of the doers and the dreamers and, the rainbow connection. Yeah, so that's where rebuttals, retorts, comments.
Really have one. There was a stat I came across recently about lazy ants, and they're not so much the hard workers, of like up to like 40% of a nest. A lot of ants that really they're pretty aimless.
So this doesn't have anything to do with Thanksgiving coming up?
Just think about the bees. There is a purpose to them. Basically, they're still kind of replacements for others. They're not replaced, actually, but they become the replacements, basically. So there's still some understanding of basically their value to the overall nest. It's not like they're seen the same way either. So some differences there. And I was just trying to think of the project kind of in between kind of malaise or indecision, or however you want to kind of call it, in between projects. I guess I have a difficulty with some of that just because there are long-term projects, for instance, like this podcast. You can think of it as each individual episode, or you can think of it as the entire endeavor. And if you think of it as the entire endeavor, it's an ongoing, no end date sort of project. Determining where you're going to get your sense of pride, or what you're kind of going to look back upon fondly, at least, is up to each individual. You really kind of have to figure out what you're going to focus on, and it has to be the things that you did accomplish versus all the things that you didn't. I think that's a difficulty that I run into frequently, is that my ambitions are larger than what I've accomplished. Therefore, in the end result, I feel bad about it because my ambition was larger and I didn't do it all the things. I did most of the things. And to Ruthie's point, probably the things that actually turned out that mattered and were possible are the things that got done. So I should, cut that down a little bit.
Yes and no. I think, this is where anybody who's done any kind of performing will tell you, you just have off nights.
Yeah.
You have a bad crowd, you're tired, you tweaked your ankle walking out of the grocery store because you're old now, right? Like, whatever happens, you just have bad nights, even though you've done all the practicing, all the whatever, and you just have to roll with it, right? You just have to have bad gigs every once in a while. I mean, that's true with speaking, that's true with, meetings in an organization. Sometimes you just have to bomb, and then you'll find out what happens, later. And most of the time it's not as bad as you think it was, right? Because you're always going to be harder on yourself than everybody else. But then there are other times where even though you did that, people will come up and say, you know what, this one aspect of it really resonated with me. Let's chat. Right.
Sure.
And that's what you can hope for any presentation is, growing the network, getting new ideas, getting rebuttals onto your ideas. Yeah, I mean, it's everywhere. You just have to be open to it, right?
I think that's a good piece. I mean, if it's from an external source and kind of reaffirming, or internally, you do have to get outside of your own head in those moments, because you can look at any event completely negatively or completely positively. That's up to you. So trying to get outside of whatever mode you're in or mood you're in. Sure. Totally see that.
And it is one of those things too, where, I mean, if you're only externally motivated, man, that's a rough world to live in. See TikTok creators. If if you have that, if it brings you joy, if you find yourself willing to do it without being paid, then I say go that way, because you have a drive and good things will come eventually, just because you're motivated to continue to do it, right? If you're forcing yourself to do it, why? Life is too short for that, don't suffer.
And even if you're not being paid, and I call that out because the immediate thing I thought of when you described that about, if there's something you're into, just go for it, right? Even if you're not being paid. So we'll have to find the official statistic on this, but one of the really sad things about retirement, at least in the United States, is that something like half of retirees are depressed. And the rates of depression are higher for those who retire in the winter than in the summertime. And part of the reason I'm given to understand is people haven't cultivated hobbies or identities outside of who they are at work.
Right.
And that is a tragedy, right? If all you are what you do on your day-to-day work and what you're getting paid for, and then that stops, in best case scenario, because you're retired, and that's all you've built towards, that's a really sad spot to be in. Mm-hmm. Not least because, when you're working and stuff, you got to do other stuff. You got to be cultivating other interests and things. Sometimes you have a bad day and it's good to be able to go out in the garden or go into the woodworking shop and go, okay, we're going to do something different. We're going to get our mind out of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have experience with that with, some musician friends of mine or artist friends of mine that, gave it a go and then started transitioning around 25, 27, 30 into the next chapter, right? Where art wasn't the thing anymore. And you go from being like 10 or 12 to 30, defining yourself as guitarist, drummer, violin player, whatever else. Now, all of a sudden you're not. You go through that same identity crisis of, okay, well, if this is just something I do, what else do I do? And it's hard. It is a hard transition. Not everybody does it well, unfortunately, because it is so hard. Yeah, but it doesn't have to wait till retirement. Unfortunately, it can happen anytime. Any career transition, coming off of the HR stuff we've talked about, even just switching from, marketing to sales, that might be enough to set somebody off, even though they're closely related. But if you've defined yourself as marketer or, HR whiz kid, now all of a sudden you're doing something else, that can be rough, that can be real rough. Alex, you seem moderately uncomfortable. Or is that just your general vibe today?
That's just my general vibe today, I think.
Okay. Well, glad I called it out publicly.
Your point of waking up with random pains is quite apparent for me today. So there's a number of things that I have injured recently. So today is just one of those fun days. It's just annoying.
And your 30s, man.
I know. It's frustrating. It's frustrating. It's all that, because whatever plans you had, then suddenly those don't happen. I guess dealing with that frustration of external pressures. There you go. That's another one to work through with projects.
All right. And now, due to time constraints, thank you for listening and participating. Email to us is in the description, YouTube and podcast descriptions. Any thoughts, comments, questions? Do you tend to drive towards things, or do you need to know all the information before you do it? How do you identify hedgehog or fox? Or are you a unicorn in a sea of horses? Pick your metaphor. And with that, we will see you in the next episode, and take care.
Cheers.